Cornel West argues that when individuals and communities suffer from a lack of love, they fall into a condition of nihilism, a deep sense of hopelessness and lovelessness that erodes meaning from life. This nihilism is not just an emotional void, it is an existential wound that affects how people think, act, and relate to one another. Without love, the human spirit becomes hollow, a shell without moral purpose or direction. Material progress or political victories, West insists, cannot heal this spiritual wound. Economic success may address surface-level hardships, but it cannot replace the deeper need for compassion, belonging, and purpose. Without love, even prosperity feels empty. Love, for West, is not a sentimental feeling or mere kindness, it is a moral and political force that shields the human soul from self-destruction. It empowers individuals to resist hatred, to see dignity in others, and to act with empathy even in the face of injustice. When a society loses its capacity to love, people grow alienated and disconnected. This alienation breeds self-destructive behaviors, addiction, violence, cynicism, and despair, all symptoms of a collective loss of meaning. Reviving love becomes a revolutionary act. It begins with self-compassion, with learning to forgive oneself and others, and with reawakening the ability to care in daily life. These small, consistent gestures become the moral foundation for social transformation. Love, in this sense, rebuilds communities. When leaders and institutions embed compassion in their decisions, justice and solidarity naturally follow. Love becomes the moral glue that gives laws and policies a human face. West insists that love must not remain confined to private life, it must enter the public sphere. Politics and policy should reflect an ethical commitment to the humanity of every person. Only then can genuine social repair begin. The love West describes as both tender and fierce, gentle in spirit but unyielding in its moral courage. It calls for resistance against oppression, but without succumbing to the hatred that oppression breeds. Such love does not come easily. It requires daily discipline, the choice to respond to cruelty with understanding, to injustice with courage, to division with connection. Love, in West's philosophy, is a lifelong moral practice. He emphasizes that the cultivation of love must be intentional. Through education, community programs, and collective engagement, people can learn to make compassion habitual. Love is not merely felt, it is taught, nurtured, and practiced. This practice must work hand in hand with structural change. Material conditions and love-based ethics reinforce one another. When people's basic needs are met and they are treated with respect, despair begins to loosen its grip. On a spiritual level, love gives people an identity larger than the self, one rooted in service, sacrifice, and shared destiny. It dissolves the isolation that fuels nihilism and replaces it with a sense of belonging to something greater. Love is also a discipline of self-awareness. Through forgiveness, reflection, and dialogue, individuals learn to confront their pain and transform it into empathy. For West, this moral education restores the capacity to see others as fully human. The political expression of love appears in moral steadfastness, when societies stand with the vulnerable, when leaders act from conscience rather than convenience, love manifests as justice in action. The process of building a culture of love, as Cornel West envisions it, is neither quick nor glamorous. It is a slow, often invisible labor of the heart and mind that unfolds in the quiet moments of daily struggle. Unlike political revolutions or economic shifts that are measured in visible outcomes, the revolution of love happens in the hidden depths of the human soul. It demands patience, humility, and perseverance, qualities that the modern world, obsessed with instant gratification, rarely celebrates. West reminds us that genuine moral growth cannot be rushed. The work of love is cumulative, building strength over time through forgiveness, understanding, and compassion that withstands the corrosive forces of despair. This steadfast love is not passive endurance, it is active resistance. It stands firm in the face of cynicism, systemic injustice, and moral decay. West emphasizes that love is not a fleeting emotion that wavers with circumstance, but a commitment, a deliberate choice to affirm life and dignity even when the world denies it. It is, in his view, the only force powerful enough to outlast despair, because it transforms suffering into meaning and resistance into hope. This kind of love is not weak, it is revolutionary. It is the courage to care in a culture that rewards indifference, the audacity to hope in a time of disillusionment, and the discipline to act with moral integrity even when there is no applause or recognition. Love, when sustained over time, nurtures deep and lasting transformation. West's vision is not one of superficial optimism but of radical renewal. He knows that quick victories often fade, while slow, steady work grounded in compassion creates enduring change. The fruits of love may not appear immediately, but they take root in the moral soil of a community and eventually reshape its entire character. Each act of kindness, each gesture of empathy, each effort to understand rather than condemn, these small seeds, planted persistently, grow into the great trees of social justice and human flourishing. Beyond the moral and political sphere, love also functions as a crucial safeguard for mental and emotional well-being. In a loving environment, individuals find psychological safety, a sense that they belong, that they are seen and valued for who they are. This sense of belonging becomes a shield against despair and alienation. West suggests that when people are nurtured by love, they begin to rediscover their capacity for self-worth and agency. They move from feeling powerless and invisible to becoming active participants in their own liberation. Love restores the fractured psyche, healing the wounds that hatred and neglect inflict. This emotional restoration, however, does not happen in isolation. Communities built on love encourage cooperation and shared purpose. They foster mutual trust, allowing individuals to depend on one another without fear of exploitation or betrayal. Such solidarity becomes the antidote to the poisons of fear, apathy, and extremism. In the absence of love, societies fracture into selfishness and suspicion, but where love prevails, human beings find common cause and moral unity. West sees this communal aspect of love as essential to democracy itself, for without trust and empathy, no political system can truly serve justice or freedom. Love also cultivates resilience. It gives people the inner strength to endure suffering without surrendering to bitterness. In an age defined by anxiety, division, and relentless competition, love becomes the source of psychological stamina. West would argue that a society grounded in love produces not fragile individuals dependent on validation, but strong souls capable of forgiveness, patience, and self-reflection. Such resilience is a quiet kind of power, one that resists domination not through aggression, but through moral steadiness and faith in the possibility of transformation. History, too, bears witness to love's redemptive and transformative power. Across generations, we see movements rooted in love, from the nonviolent struggle of Martin Luther King Jr. to the compassionate leadership of Nelson Mandela, that have reshaped moral consciousness. These were not movements of vengeance or retaliation but of moral awakening, proving that love is not naive but profoundly strategic in dismantling systems of hate. West invites us to see these examples not as exceptions but as blueprints. Love, when made active and public, becomes a force capable of altering the very course of history. These historical narratives form what West calls the moral memory of humanity. They remind us that human beings are at their best when guided by empathy and care rather than fear or domination. The stories of love overcoming hatred serve as ethical anchors in a world drifting toward moral relativism. They teach us that progress without compassion is hollow, and that power without love becomes tyranny. Through these memories, each generation inherits not only lessons of resistance but also a moral duty to keep love alive as the foundation of justice. Yet, West's message is not a mere reflection on history, it is a moral summons to the present. He warns that love cannot remain an abstract value or a philosophical ideal. To speak of love without living it is to betray its meaning. Love must take tangible form in how we govern, how we educate, how we treat the poor, and how we respond to those we disagree with. It must be woven into our daily choices and collective structures. Without this lived ethic, societies risk collapsing into moral emptiness, where people mistake comfort for virtue and profit for progress. Ultimately, West's call for love is both an urgent warning and a hopeful invitation. He reminds us that nihilism, the sense of meaninglessness and despair, can only be conquered through a moral and spiritual revival rooted in love. This revival begins not with grand speeches or political reforms, but with the simple, radical act of caring for one another. Love, when practiced collectively, restores humanity's soul. It rekindles the light of compassion in dark times and reminds us that, despite all suffering, the human spirit still holds the power to create, to heal, and to hope again. Agape, in Cornel West's usage and in the Christian and prophetic traditions he draws from, names a love that is fundamentally other-directed, an ethical disposition that refuses to reduce the other to an instrument for one's own ends. It is not a feeling limited to affection or preference, it is a moral stance that recognizes the intrinsic worth of another human being, regardless of utility, status, or identity. This recognition is the starting point for a thoroughgoing political and moral critique of social life that tolerates exploitation and neglect. Agape challenges the habitual categories by which modern societies divide people. Where tribal loyalties, racial hierarchies, and class divisions tempt communities to prioritize insiders over outsiders, Agape insists on a horizon of care that extends beyond those borders. It insists that our responsibilities to one another are not calibrated by convenience or similarity but by shared humanity. In practice, this means elevating solidarity over suspicion and mutual obligation over transactional belonging. The prophetic and Christian roots of agape give it both moral depth and a confrontational edge. Prophetic voices in religious history, those who spoke truth to power, used agape not as a gentle consolation but as a weaponized ethic, a demand that power be held accountable to the dignity of the least among us. The rhetoric of love here is not sentimental softness but a disciplined insistence that justice be made visible in institutions, policies, and daily social practices. Agape also destabilizes the privatization of morality. When love is relegated to the sphere of private feelings or individual therapy, it loses its capacity to transform public life. The tradition West adapts restores love to the public square as a standard for judging political arrangements and economic systems. It asks whether our laws, markets, and civic structures embody compassion and respect or whether they systematically degrade human beings for the sake of profit and efficiency. This ethical love opposes commodification by contesting the logic that treats persons as means to ends. Under commodifying regimes, value is measured by productivity, profitability, or exchange value. Agape refuses those metrics and reorients attention to qualitative goods, dignity, belonging, and the ability to flourish. That reorientation has concrete consequences, in labor policy, in criminal justice, in housing, because it changes the baseline question from, what can this person produce? To, how shall we honor this person's inherent worth? To practice agape is to practice moral risk. It is easy to love those who love us back. The moral test is whether we can love those who are alien, feared, or even hostile. The prophetic tradition supplies a long list of examples where love demanded courage, confronting brutal rulers, exposing systemic sins, and defending the oppressed at personal cost. Agape, therefore, is inseparable from political courage, the willingness to suffer loss rather than betray moral truth. Agape's non-sentimental character is crucial. Sentimentality reduces love to an indulgent softness that avoids conflict and evades justice. By contrast, agape requires clarity, judgment, and the capacity to say no to entrenched harms. It involves ethical discernment, identifying structural sin, naming moral culpability, and mobilizing collective energies to rectify wrongs. This is love in the mode of corrective action, not passive acceptance. One of the strengths of agape is its capacity to generate solidarity across difference. When love is rooted in the recognition of shared vulnerability, the fragile conditions of embodied life, it fosters alliances between groups whose interests might otherwise appear separate. Racial justice movements, labor organizing, feminist struggles, and immigrant rights campaigns find common cause under an agape-informed ethics because they converge on the need to affirm human dignity against depredation. Agape also reshapes the content of moral education. Teaching young people to act from a place of unconditional care does not mean abstract platitudes, it means forming moral habits, listening to the marginalized, learning the history of oppression, cultivating empathy through sustained practices, and translating compassion into concrete civic action. Moral education in an agapeic framework is both formation of character and instruction in structural critique. In everyday life, agape manifests in practices that resist alienation. Sharing resources, creating mutual aid networks, tending the sick, and offering sanctuary to those in peril are small, repeated acts that instantiate a different social logic. When repeated across communities and institutionalized within policy, these practices accumulate into a culture that privileges care over extraction. They become alternative economies of mutual support. The theological texture of agape in the prophetic Christian vein refuses easy privatization of salvation. Salvation is not an isolated spiritual transaction but the communal restoration of broken relations. The prophets and Jesus-centered narratives emphasize communal redemption, love that heals social rifts and reorders public allegiances. Thus agape drives attention toward systemic restoration, not only individual conversion. Agape requires humility. It presupposes that one does not possess the full truth and must be open to hearing the other's suffering. This epistemic humility, the willingness to let one's view be shaped by the voices of those most affected by injustice, is a radical break with hegemonic epistemologies that silence subaltern perspectives. Loving well, therefore, demands cultivating listening skills and a disposition to be transformed by what one learns. Linked to that humility is the ethic of forgiveness intrinsic to agape. Forgiveness does not mean the erasure of responsibility or forgetting harm, rather, it is a choice to refuse permanent retaliation and to open a path for moral rehabilitation. In political life, forgiveness can allow societies to move from cycles of retribution to processes of reconciliation, truth-telling, and institutional reform, though it must be tethered to accountability. Agape's solidarity is not merely symbolic, it requires material commitment. To say, "we are with you," must mean redistributing resources, employing reparative policies, and building structures of care. Symbolic gestures, proclamations, memorials, or rhetoric, without substantive policy change are inadequate. The ethical power of agape is measured by the willingness to put resources where one's love claims to be. This orientation toward material redistribution confronts liberal individualism. Neoliberal ideologies celebrate autonomy and personal responsibility, often ignoring structural constraints that shape life chances. Agape challenges the myth that success is purely individual merit. It spotlights how collective obligations, through taxation, public services, and social insurance, can embody love at scale by protecting the vulnerable and enabling flourishing. The prophetic component of agape insists on prophetic critique of institutions. Prophets named systemic sin and called for repentance of the collective. In modern terms, agape-inspired critique uncovers the ways educational systems, prisons, healthcare, and housing policies act as mechanisms of marginalization. The prophetic call is not merely to compassion but to structural transformation that prevents future harm. Agape fosters political imagination. It helps communities envision institutions organized around care rather than punishment, around restoration rather than extraction. This imaginative work is politically potent because it supplies alternatives to despair, concrete visions of societies where people are not disposable but are rather woven into webs of mutual dependency and responsibility. To adopt agape is to adopt a long time frame. Like many prophetic traditions, it understands moral work as intergenerational. Love's labor rarely pays off in a single election cycle or quarterly report. It invests in the slow cultivation of civic virtue, infrastructure of care, and cultural norms that sustain justice across decades. This long view resists the short-termism that undermines structural reform. Agape complicates the notion of power. It does not romanticize powerlessness, nor does it fetishize power as domination. Instead, it reimagines power as the capacity to create conditions for others to flourish. Power exercised through agape is accountable, service-oriented, and oriented toward emancipation rather than domination. This conception transforms leadership models in politics, business, and civil society. Practically, agape reorients policy priorities. Healthcare becomes a site of love when access is treated as a moral right, not a market commodity. Education becomes loving when it equips every child with the tools for critical thought and civic participation. Housing policy demonstrates agape when it guarantees shelter as a baseline condition for human dignity. These policy shifts reflect a moral calculus rooted in care. Agape also restructures how we think about justice. Retributive impulses are tempered by restorative possibilities that seek to heal both victims and perpetrators where possible. Restorative justice models, community-based rehabilitation, and reinvestment in vulnerable neighborhoods reflect agape's preference for repair over mere punishment. The aim is to reintegrate rather than cast out permanently. This ethic shapes economic imagination too. Cooperative enterprises, community land trusts, and worker-owned businesses instantiate agapeic ideals by distributing ownership and ensuring that profit does not become the sole arbiter of value. Such economic experiments challenge the dominant capitalist logic by inserting moral criteria into decisions about production, distribution, and governance. Agape requires robust institutions of care. Love scales not only through individual virtue but through institutions that embed care in their core functions. Public libraries, universal healthcare systems, public schooling, and comprehensive social safety nets serve as infrastructural embodiments of an agape culture. They convert private sentiments into public goods. Narrative and cultural work are essential to agape's power. Stories, art, music, and ritual shape moral imaginations and teach the sympathetic habits necessary for solidarity. Cultural forms can normalize care, make visible marginalized lives, and foster the emotional infrastructure that sustains political movements. The prophetic tradition itself tells stories that reframe suffering and resilience in ways that mobilize collective compassion. Agape also counsels vigilance against paternalism. To love responsibly is to respect agency and avoid imposing solutions without participation from those affected. Solidarity is not substitution, it is accompaniment. Ethical love partners with communities, supporting them to define their own paths rather than prescribing paternalistic remedies that reproduce domination under the guise of benevolence. Critically, agape entails a particular epistemic posture toward markets and technology. It asks whether innovations increase the capacity for people to live dignified lives or whether they further entrench surveillance, exploitation, and alienation. An agapeic critique scrutinizes technological adoption through a moral lens. Does this serve the flourishing of persons or the expansion of profit at their expense? Agape also fosters international solidarity. It resists narrow nationalism and recognizes that global structures, trade regimes, climate policy, migration systems, require ethical commitments across borders. Loving one's neighbor, on this scale, means engaging with international justice, reparative climate action, equitable trade practices, and humane migration policies that preserve human dignity. Personal transformation complements structural change in agape's account. Individuals must cultivate virtues, patience, courage, fidelity, and humility that make sustained commitment possible. Such inner work is not merely therapeutic, it is civic preparation. A polity composed of persons shaped by these dispositions is far more likely to sustain institutions that honor human worth. Finally, agape's ethical power is ultimately transformative because it refuses to accept alienation as destiny. It affirms that human beings can reorganize their attachments, reconfigure their institutions, and remake their relations so that care, not exploitation, becomes the organizing principle. In doing so, agape offers both a critique of present evils and a hopeful blueprint for societies that cherish the dignity of every life. Cornel West draws a clear line between spirituality and the institutional trappings of organized religion. Spirituality, for him, is not primarily about subscription to a creed or attendance at sacred ceremonies, but about an inward and outward formation of character that orients a person toward truth, justice, and love. This orientation is experiential and existential rather than merely doctrinal. It is a practice of being in the world that continually interrogates the soul, exposes hypocrisy, and commits one to moral action. Where formal religion can sometimes calcify into rote ritual and defensive dogma, spirituality remains a living, dynamic force that critiques and renews institutions rather than simply reproducing them. True spirituality, as West articulates it, requires courage to face uncomfortable realities about oneself and one's community. It insists on moral honesty, naming one's complicity in structures of injustice, confessing the ways in which loyalty to comfort or privilege has warped ethical judgment, and accepting the hard work of repentance and repair. This kind of spiritual discipline produces people who are not content with spiritual piety alone but who translate inner transformation into outward commitments. It is the refusal to separate the sacred from the civic, the private from the public, so that inner convictions naturally move toward social responsibility. Spirituality beyond organized religion also privileges prophetic imagination over clerical comfort. The prophetic tradition, which West often invokes, calls prophets to challenge power, to stand with the marginalized, and to keep the conscience of a society alive. Prophetic spirituality is uncomfortable, restless, and disruptive because it refuses to let systems of oppression be normalized. It is not a gentle withdrawal from the world but an engaged, sometimes costly involvement that holds institutions accountable to deeper moral standards. In this way, spirituality becomes a force for social critique and moral urgency. This spirituality insists that faith be measured by its fruits in the world. Rituals and doctrines may shape community and language, but they are insufficient as moral criteria unless they produce justice, mercy, and solidarity. West spirituality asks, do our religious practices bind us more tightly to the suffering of others, or do they provide alibis for moral inaction? The test of authentic spirituality is whether it leads one to stand with the poor, to oppose degrading policies, and to nurture relationships that extend beyond one's immediate circle of benefit. At the heart of spirituality beyond institutional religion lies a cultivated interior life capable of sustaining ethical action over time. Spiritual practices, prayer, meditation, contemplative reading, disciplined study, and communal rites of reflection, serve as sources of resilience. They sharpen moral discernment and replenish the energies necessary for sustained activism. West emphasizes that without some disciplined interior life, movements can burn bright and then burn out. Deep spiritual roots provide the stamina required for long struggles against entrenched injustice. Spirituality also reshapes how one understands identity and belonging. Instead of identity being primarily defined by race, class, profession, or religious label, spirituality enlarges identity into an ethical and existential kinship with all suffering. This does not erase particular histories or the need for political solidarity among specific groups, rather, it grounds those solidarities in a broader commitment to human worth. It provides a language for connecting particular struggles to a shared moral horizon, thereby fostering alliances that are both principled and empathetic. An essential feature of this spirituality is its insistence on humility. True spiritual formation recognizes the limits of one's knowledge and the ease with which moral perception can be clouded by self-interest. Humility opens one to learning from those on the margins and to being corrected by the lived experiences of others. It destabilizes the arrogance that breeds paternalism in political movements and encourages practices of listening, mutual formation, and shared leadership. In West's view, humility is not weakness but an ethical posture that preserves solidarity from co-optation. Spirituality beyond organized religion also implies a radical critique of religiosity that is used to justify domination. West is keen to expose how theological language can be weaponized to rationalize oppression, sanctify status quo injustices, or silence dissent. A living spirituality refuses such uses of religion, it refuses theological cover for cruelty and instead reclaims sacred language as a vocabulary for liberation. This reclamation is both an ethical and hermeneutical task. It requires reinterpreting sacred texts and traditions in ways that emphasize dignity and resistance rather than submission and exclusion. The moral depth spirituality contributes to social movements is practical and formative. Activists guided by spiritual commitments typically incorporate disciplines that guard against burnout, cynicism, and moral compromise. They develop rituals of mutual care, processes for accountability, and practices of forgiveness that allow movements to correct their course without fracturing. Spirituality supplies the relational resources, patience, empathy, vulnerability, that make durable coalitions possible, turning temporary alliances into communities of sustained moral work. Spirituality also teaches that justice is not merely the redistribution of goods but the transformation of relational patterns. This insight shifts attention from purely material policies to the quality of human interactions, whether institutions respect dignity, whether discourse fosters recognition, whether public life cultivates the virtues necessary for democratic flourishing. West's approach insists that without altering the moral textures of everyday life, how people see themselves and others, policy changes will remain fragile and subject to reversal. Moreover, spirituality can act as an interpretive lens that supplies meaning to political struggle. Against nihilism and despair, spiritual narratives offer frameworks of hope, suffering, and redemption that help activists endure setbacks and learn from failure. These narratives are not escapist myths but formative stories that make sense of sacrifice and provide a telos, an ultimate orientation, that transcends immediate tactical gains. In this way, spirituality maintains a moral horizon against the cynicism that pragmatism sometimes breeds. This spiritual frame also encourages a broader conception of freedom. Freedom is not merely liberation from external constraints but also emancipation from internal deformations, greed, fear, apathy, and vindictiveness. Spiritual formation attends to both structures and souls, believing that a just society requires citizens who are both free in the political sense and free from the internal compulsions that make justice impossible. West spirituality thus seeks coherence between inner virtues and outer institutions. Central to this project is the cultivation of moral imagination. Spiritual practices expand one's capacity to envision alternative possibilities for communal life. By nurturing empathy and the habit of placing oneself in another's predicament, spirituality enlarges the moral imagination necessary to conceive systemic reforms that are humane and realistic. It makes it harder to accept policies that treat people as obstacles or externalities and easier to see them as ends in themselves. Spirituality in West's sense also reorients leadership. Leaders formed by spiritual commitments are less likely to pursue ego-driven agendas and more likely to steward power as service. This kind of leadership emphasizes accountability, transparency, and a willingness to be held to moral standards that surpass political expedience. Spiritual leaders encourage cultivation of conscience within institutions, modeling restraint and fidelity rather than dominance and accumulation. The relationship between spirituality and truth is another crucial axis. For West, spirituality demands a rigorous pursuit of truth, not mere adherence to comforting narratives, but the disciplined willingness to face painful realities and to revise one's beliefs accordingly. This epistemic honesty is essential for any movement seeking transformative change. It prevents self-deception and ensures that moral claims are grounded in a clear-eyed analysis of social conditions. Spirituality beyond organized religion also fosters interfaith and intercultural solidarity. Because it focuses on practices and ethical commitments more than denominational specifics, it opens space for collaboration across religious and secular divides. West's orientation encourages movements to draw on a rich plurality of spiritual resources while centering shared ethical aims. Such pluralism enhances democratic vibrancy and builds broader coalitions for justice. This spirituality is not opposed to institutional religion in principle. Rather, it challenges religious institutions to become faithful to their deepest moral callings. Religious communities that take spirituality seriously can provide invaluable resources, moral critique, communal support, educational infrastructure, and moral exemplars. West envisions religious institutions as allies when they are humble, prophetic, and oriented toward liberation rather than privilege. Spirituality also reshapes pedagogy. Education informed by spiritual commitments emphasizes moral formation alongside technical training, cultivating citizens who are critically minded and compassionately engaged. Such pedagogy fosters the kind of civic literacy that respects pluralism while insisting on certain moral non-negotiables: dignity, justice, and mutual accountability. West's framework seeks to create learners who are prepared to participate in public life not merely as competitors but as caretakers. The existential dimension of spirituality bears repeating. Struggles for justice are not only political contests but also battles over the soul. Activism without spiritual reflection risks becoming mechanistic or reactionary. Spiritual depth preserves the movement's telos and prevents it from reproducing the very vices it opposes. West's insistence on the existential stakes is a reminder that politics must be animated by moral seriousness to avoid devolving into mere power plays. Finally, spirituality beyond organized religion is a call to integrate personal transformation with public action. It refuses neat separations between private piety and public responsibility. For West, the most enduring social change comes when individuals cultivate inner virtues that are then reflected in communal institutions and public policies. This integration is the moral architecture for a just society: spiritual depth informing political breadth, and collective action sustained by personal integrity. Cornel West insists that democracy is not merely a set of institutions or legal arrangements, it is a moral way of life that depends on cultivated affections. Laws and rights provide the skeleton, but love and spirituality furnish the muscle and blood that animate a humane polity. Without these moral affections, democratic procedures become empty rituals and rights become paper promises. The spirit that animates civic cooperation, trust, empathy, mutual regard, is sustained by habits of heart that are cultivated through spiritual practice and loving commitment. Love in this civic sense is not sentimental. It is a disciplined orientation that requires citizens to care for one another as political equals, to recognize each person's inherent dignity, and to act on that recognition in public deliberation and policy. When love guides public life, policy debates are not solely contests of interest and power but moral conversations about the common good. This ethical tone reorients politics away from zero-sum calculation toward shared flourishing, making compromise possible without moral betrayal. Spirituality supplies the deeper sources of meaning that enable citizens to sacrifice narrow gains for broader goods. Political life often demands patience, restraint, and the willingness to bear short-term losses for long-term justice. These capacities draw on a spirit of hope and commitment that is cultivated by spiritual disciplines, practices that teach people to see beyond immediate gratification and to invest in futures that may outlast their own lifetimes. In this way, spirituality undergirds the slow work of democratic repair. Mutual respect is the civic fruit of love and spirituality. When people are formed by practices that honor the other, they are more likely to listen, to treat opponents not as enemies but as moral interlocutors, and to engage in dialogue that seeks truth rather than mere victory. Respect widens the moral imagination so that even those with stark disagreements can inhabit a common public world. This civility is not a hollow politeness but a recognition of the other's claim to humane treatment and political participation. Moral accountability follows naturally when love and spirituality anchor public life. Leaders and citizens formed by these commitments are answerable not only to voters or laws but to higher ethical standards. Accountability becomes a moral discipline, publicly exercised not as vengeance but as a corrective measure to realign institutions with the principles of dignity and justice. This transforms scandals and corruption from mere legalities into moral failures that demand communal remediation. Democracy without love-driven spirituality risks reducing politics to mere competition among selves. When civic engagement is driven primarily by personal gain, the common good becomes collateral damage. Greed and instrumental rationality take the lead, and solidarity frays. West warns against this commodifying drift. Market ethics alone cannot sustain the shared attachments democracy requires. A republic of isolated maximizers corrodes the social fabric by turning neighbors into rivals and common projects into transactional exchanges. The prophetic love ethic West advocates is not naive optimism, it is a call to moral courage. Prophetic voices in history exposed injustice and demanded remaking of public life, often at personal cost. A prophetic love ethic fuses tenderness for the vulnerable with resolute denunciation of structures that harm them. It compels leaders and citizens alike to act when institutions betray moral commitments and to risk reputational or political cost in service of justice. Leadership changes when guided by a prophetic love ethic. Leaders shaped by spiritual and moral disciplines approach power as stewardship rather than domination. They prioritize the needs of the least advantaged, accept criticism with humility, and cultivate policies that reflect care rather than purely strategic advantage. Such leadership models create institutions that are responsive, humane, and oriented toward long-term communal well-being. A politics grounded in love also places moral education at the center of civic life. Schools, civic institutions, and cultural practices should cultivate virtues, empathy, courage, honesty, solidarity, that equip citizens for democratic membership. This education is not about indoctrination but formation, teaching how to listen, how to deliberate in good faith, and how to translate compassion into concrete policy commitments. Cultivating citizens in this way increases the resilience of democratic norms. When love animates institutions, public goods become expressions of communal care. Health care, housing, public education, and social safety nets cease to be optional benefits and instead become manifestations of a society's commitment to human dignity. Investing in these goods is then understood as an extension of civic love, practical structures that protect the vulnerable and enable all to participate in the political community as equals. The emotional climate of a democracy matters. Fear, cynicism, and resentment poison public life and make cooperative governance difficult. Love and spirituality mitigate those toxins by fostering trust and hope. They provide narratives of shared purpose and moral identity that counteract the alienation modernity often produces. This effective work is as crucial to democracy as legal frameworks because it sustains the interpersonal bonds necessary for collective action. Love-driven spirituality also strengthens civic resilience in times of crisis. Faced with economic downturns, social unrest, or political polarization, communities anchored by moral commitments are better able to mobilize collective resources, sustain mutual aid, and pursue restorative measures. Spiritual resources, faith, ritual, communal solidarity, provide psychological steadiness and ethical clarity when pragmatic solutions alone are insufficient. Democratic renewal requires a renewal of public speech and discourse. When love and spirituality inform rhetoric, public speech becomes less about demonizing others and more about persuasion, truth-telling, and the common good. This does not eliminate political passion or contestation but channels them into forms that respect persons as ends, not means. A healthier public sphere emerges where disagreement is vigorous but not dehumanizing. The prophetic love ethic is attentive to structural injustice. Love here demands systemic diagnosis and repair, not merely private charity but public policies that address the root causes of inequality. This means confronting segregation, criminal justice disparities, economic marginalization, and other institutional harms with the urgency and moral clarity of a movement guided by spiritual imperatives toward justice. Restorative justice policies exemplify the marriage of love and democratic practice. Where punitive responses dominate, social wounds deepen and civic trust erodes. A love-informed approach favors restoration, reconciliation, and transformation, processes that repair relationships, reintegrate disenfranchised citizens, and rebuild communal bonds. Such practices demonstrate that democracy's goal is not merely order but moral healing. A love-centered democracy elevates the voices of those historically marginalized. Spirituality encourages attentiveness to the suffering of others and demands that democratic institutions be inclusive in both representation and policy focus. Inclusion becomes an ethical imperative grounded in the recognition that a polity's legitimacy rests on its ability to honor and protect all its members, especially the dispossessed. Economic policy, under a prophetic love ethic, is judged by human flourishing rather than aggregate growth. Measures of prosperity expand beyond GDP to include health, education, ecological sustainability, and communal well-being. Love reorients economic judgment toward metrics that reflect human dignity and the capacity for citizens to lead meaningful lives. This revaluation challenges narrow technocratic approaches that prioritize efficiency over people. The civic arts, literature, music, ritual, public commemoration, play a vital role in sustaining democratic love. Cultural practices shape civic imagination and moral sympathies. Monuments, public ceremonies, and communal storytelling that honor shared struggles and celebrate mutual sacrifice reinforce civic bonds. These cultural forms make tangible the values that laws alone cannot secure. Democracy requires a politics of hope, and spirituality supplies that hope. It furnishes narratives of redemption and possibility that motivate people to engage despite setbacks. Hope grounded in love is not naive but resilient. It persists because it is anchored in lived practices of mutual aid and moral commitment. This hope is the adhesive that binds disparate struggles into a coherent democratic project. Finally, West's vision is a practical one. Building a democracy sustained by love and spirituality demands concrete institutions, disciplined leaders, and formed citizens. It asks for policy experiments that embody care, educational reforms that cultivate moral capacities, and leadership styles that model humility and service. This comprehensive transformation is difficult, but it is the pathway by which democratic renewal becomes not just an aspiration but a lived reality.